Very warm welcome to today's session on behalf of the UK IGF. It's been great to see the interest that we've had in this session, and we're really happy to have you with us. My name's Alicia, and I'm a Policy and Public Affairs Lead at Nominet, the .uk Internet Registry, and I also provide the Secretariat for UK IGF. We will actually hold a full UK IGF in the autumn, but we didn't want to miss the opportunity to have a forum for discussion on the 20-year review of WSIS, given that this process is really kind of already gaining momentum and will continue to do so over the coming months. WSIS+20 provides a key moment for us to take stock of the progress made towards achieving the vision of WSIS, which was a people-centered, inclusive and development-oriented information society, to think about what has happened over the past 20 years and also think about where there's further to go and what we do in the future. We have an excellent range of speakers today to share their perspectives. But one thing I think it's important to mention is that obviously UK IGF has organised this event and we're keen to hear UK stakeholder views, but we also welcome interventions from other participants. But just to say that in kind of moderating the event, we will try and prioritise UK stakeholder views. Just because this is kind of happening under the auspices of UK IGF, but everyone is of course very welcome, and we're really happy to have you here with us today. Next slide, please, Sam. Just a quick canter through of our agenda. We're in the opening remarks now, and then we'll have an introduction to WSIS and some highlights from the UN CSTD report that was published in March from David Suter, who was actually the lead consultant on that report. We'll then have 10 minutes for Q&A with David, and then we'll move on to interventions from our excellent range of other speakers. And that will then be followed by Q&A and an opportunity for those joining this meeting to speak and share what their approach to WSIS is. And then we'll just have some quick concluding remarks. So next slide, please, Anne. Just some housekeeping. So obviously inclusive and respectful discussions are very much the lifeblood of IGFs. And we'd like to thank you all for accepting the UN IGF Code of Conduct when you signed up to this meeting. We are recording the session and we'll make the content available via the UK IGF website in due course. We'll be using the Q&A function on Zoom. That might be familiar to those who've attended UK IGF remotely previously. So you can access that by clicking more and then Q&A. And yeah, we'll take one set of questions after David is presented and then the rest towards the end of the session once we've heard from all our speakers. We'll read your question out for you, so please include your name and organisation if you wish to be credited, but it's also fine to remain anonymous. And if you'd actually like to request to speak or comment, then please send request with your name and organisation in the Q&A function, and we'll give you a reminder of these directions again, because I realise that's a lot to take in. I think just before we get started, this is the first UK IGF session we've had since our good colleague and friend Nigel Hickson passed away. Nigel was very supportive of this session and the wider kind of internet governance and WSIS agenda. I know he was a friend to many of us as well as a colleague, and we'll remember his good humour, kindness, and kind of depth of knowledge and real belief in the cause. For many years to come. I think I was speaking to Paul from GC yesterday, and that it's clear there's been a real outpouring of kind of love and affection and lovely stories about the experiences that people have had with Nigel. And so if it's okay, we'll just take a minute's silence now to remember our colleague and friend. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Moving on to our first speaker, actually a good friend of Nigel's, David Suter, who is known to many of us on this call. David is an independent expert on digital society and its impacts on the economy, society, the environment, and governance. He's led many studies for UN agencies and development agencies over the past 20 years, including UNCTAD, UNESCO, ITU, DESA, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the European Commission. He led the 10-year review of WSIS for the UN Commission on Science and Tech for Development, and was also the lead consultant for the 20-year review report that was published in March. David has also recently been contracted by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, to work on the General Assembly phase of the WSIS+20 process. So we're delighted to have him with us today to provide an overview of WSIS, to talk about the CSDD report, and to situate some of this in the kind of wider geopolitical and development climate. So we'll hear for David for the next 15 minutes. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. So as you say, I'll try to give an introduction to WSIS, just in case there are some people on the call who aren't familiar with it, outline the report that's recently been published and is to go to the General Assembly shortly, and then say a little bit about the process. In other words, I'm trying to set the context for the discussion that will follow. And as Alicia said, I've been involved with WSIS one way or another, actually for a very long time, since the preparations for the summit began in the late 90s. So I was at both sessions of the summit, led the 10-year review, and have just completed the 20-year review report for the Commission on Science and Technology for Development. And I've also drafted the Secretary General's annual reports on WSIS implementation for the last decade or so. And where the IGF is concerned, I've been at all but two of the annual meetings, and I was lead consultant for the UN expert group meeting, which looked at options for improvements to the IGF about 3 years ago. In terms of what I'm now doing, I've just been appointed by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs to work with the co-facilitators of the General Assembly review for WSIS+20. So outlining the issues for negotiation, developing the zero draft, assessing contributions that are made in the consultation process, and I'll also be looking at options for development of the IGF. So it's obviously really useful to me to hear views in meetings like this, and I expect to be hearing a lot more from different stakeholders in different countries between now and December, when the General Assembly meets to review WSIS after 20 years. I should be clear, though, that I'm speaking in an individual capacity here. I'm not representing the UN process in any way, though there are obviously some constraints on what I can say in response to questions. So I thought I'd start with a reminder of what WSIS was and is. It's going to be obvious to many of you on the call, but it won't be familiar to everyone, and it's worth the reminder, I think. It was a United Nations summit held in two phases in 2003 and 2005. It resulted in agreements that have set the agenda for international discussions on digital development since then, including the Global Digital Compact, the GDC, which was adopted last year at the General Assembly and seeks to apply those principles to some of the issues that have arisen since the summit. So the 2003 outcome documents, which are the Geneva Declaration of Principles and the Geneva Action Plan, they set out principles and frameworks across many areas of digital development. And the overarching vision was to seek an information society that would be, I quote, inclusive, human-centered and development-oriented, unquote, and consistent with sustainable development and human rights. Those documents established action lines on technical issues such as connectivity and cybersecurity, and in public policy areas such as development, health, and education. And they also set some targets which expired 10 years ago and which look very, very much out of date today if you go back and look at them. The Tunis agenda, which was the main outcome from 2005, was concerned with the two issues on which agreement couldn't be reached in Geneva, that is, financing mechanisms and the internet. And it agreed a definition of internet governance, which covers both technical and public policy issues, and among other things, it set up the IGF. Now, the IGF's mandate is included in this review. It was initially for 5 years, renewed in 2010, and again in 2015 for a 10-year period, and it's open for renewal again this year. And WSIS was also where the multi-stakeholder approach became established as a sort of starting point for international digital discussions within the UN system and to some degree elsewhere. Now, the WSIS, one or two final things about the origins, I think, here. The WSIS outcome documents are often described as the settled view of the international community, and I think it's worth remembering as we look forward to the negotiations here that both in Geneva and in Tunis, they were the result of really tortuous negotiations that actually right up to the last minute often looked as if no agreement would be reached. In practice, though, they have proved lasting, and I think that's a sort of a signal that we ought to remember as we think about the process we're about to go through here. I'd emphasize a couple of other things. The first, which should be pretty obvious, is that the digital world today is very different from 20 years ago. A phrase that we use in the report is that the information society was then an aspiration and very different from the reality we see around us now. So almost all of the technology and services we're now concerned with are post-WSIS. And the mandates for the action lines as a result are very different from what they would be if they were written today. It's why the consultation process this past year and the report, which has just been completed, why they're as much concerned with looking forwards as with what's happened in the last 2 decades. And the second point is that WSIS is not primarily about the internet. And I appreciate that may be the principal interest for many people in this meeting, but it's not the principal concern of the summit outcome documents or of most of the governments that will be taking part in the review. They're most concerned about the impact of digitalization on their economies and societies, and about the extent to which their countries have a say in how the digital society develops. So to summarize that, and the principles agreed at WSIS have remained largely consistent since 2005, but the context for digital development and the implications for digital governance have changed very considerably. Now, how does that play out in the report, which has just been published by the Commission on Science and Technology for Development, and will now be going forward to the General Assembly? You can find it on the CSTD website. It's still called a draft there, by the way, because that's what it needs to be called until it's approved by the UN Economic and Social Council in a couple of months. It's around 65,000 words, but it's deliberately written to allow readers to select the sections that most interest them if they don't want to read the whole text. So what does it say has happened since WSIS? Well, first, I'd emphasize enormous change. The first part of the report focuses on technology and services. Most of the technologies at the heart of the information society today have emerged or at least been transformed since the summit. If you read the outcome documents, there are almost no references, for example, in them to mobile phones, because at the time, mobility was not seen as likely to be the principal means of access to the internet. So mobile broadband, social media, other digital platforms, the Internet of Things, the cloud economy, hyperscale data centers, generative AI, these are all phenomena that have become central to the digital society since WSIS. They're not obviously outcomes of the summit itself, but the report considers ways in which their evolution has been influenced by the ethos and the vision that the summit established. And by the impetus this is given to thinking about digitalization's impact and potential in governance institutions. Many of the developing country governments that responded to the consultation referred to the value of the action lines, for example, in developing their national strategies. And the second overarching change described in the report concerns the extent to which digital technologies have become pervasive in individual lives and in the structures of our economy, societies, and cultures. Access and connectivity are obviously central to this, and the report illustrates the growth in access and usage of digital technologies by individuals, but it also stresses the extent to which that growth is incomplete. And it notes, and I think this is really important, it notes the growing concern as a result of that incompleteness that digitalization is currently reinforcing social and economic inequalities between countries and within societies rather than reducing them. And alongside that, it describes the ways in which digitalization has altered, in some cases transformed, the structures of economies and societies, to the emergence of e-government, the development of the digital economy, the displacement of traditional modes of production and consumption, the emergence of powerful data corporations, dynamic impacts, for good or ill, on human rights, including expression and privacy, the complex relationship that's emerged between digitalization and environmental sustainability. WSIS articulated most of those issues as they were at the time of the summit in its action lines. And so the report considers the implementation of these and of the other WSIS outcomes in 6 themes. And those themes are digital inclusion, the digital ecosystem, the digital economy, sustainable development, human rights, and digital governance. And particular attention is also paid to gender equity and women's rights and to the rights and welfare of children. So obviously worth remembering that none of this has taken place in isolation. The report reminds us that the pace of digital development has been affected by 2 global crises since the summit, by the economic crisis in 2008-9, which seems a very long time ago now, but was really important and dramatic at the time, and obviously by the COVID-19 pandemic 5 years or so ago. And there have been major changes in international relations. In particular, since the summit, around the time of the WSIS+10 review, the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has the ambitious Sustainable Development Goals within it. The COVID pandemic set back progress to many of those, and the UN's been emphatic in asserting the potential of digital technologies to put the goals back on track. Now, I won't go into this in detail, but it's clear from recent discussions, including CSTD's annual meeting a couple of weeks ago, that the relationship between WSIS outcomes and the SDGs is going to be a major point of discussion as this review goes forward. Not all governments are committed to the SDGs. So alongside the digital specific themes within this review, I think it also needs to be seen within the broader context of what is happening in the world in general, and to thinking about development policy, thinking about the other UN priorities of peace and security, of conflict resolution, and of poverty eradication, and of gender rights, and so forth. Alongside opportunities, there's been growing awareness of risks arising from digitalization, and those are also addressed in the report. So I've mentioned already the perception that inequality is increasing economic and social inequality between and within societies, something that goes back at least 10 years to studies by the World Bank in the middle of the last decade. There's also much concern about the impact of digitalization on environmental outcomes, including climate change, pollution, the overuse of scarce resources. There are human rights concerns, including issues related to information integrity, to gender-based violence, other forms of abuse, complex issues surrounding children's rights and welfare. So the report reflects growing acknowledgement of the need for digital frameworks to recognize risk as well as opportunity, and also to ensuring that no one's left behind the key target of the Sustainable Development Goals, understanding that that's more complex than just providing access, and actually more complex than just providing meaningful and affordable access that reaches into other areas of development and change within society. So it's concerned with the future as well as the past. Some of the issues that have arisen since WSIS are addressed in the Global Digital Compact, the GDC, which was adopted by the General Assembly last year. For instance, data management, artificial intelligence, the ethical and regulatory frameworks required to meet broader goals of public policy, or the common good, however you want to phrase that. Many of the contributors to the consultation emphasized the importance of ensuring consistency and coherence after the review and as an outcome of the review between the WSIS outcomes and the GDC, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Pact for the Future, which is the broader agreement adopted by the General Assembly last year about the overall direction of international relations and the role of the UN. So I've not said much specifically about the internet or the IGF here, because I assume others will do that after me. The WSIS arrangements for internet governance were broadly supported in the consultation process. The IGF in particular was regarded as a success. There are proposals made for improvements to the IGF, as there have been over the years. As I mentioned earlier, my contract with the UN includes looking at options for its future development. So I can respond to some degree to specific questions if they're raised in a moment. I'll close in a minute with a few words on the process, but I thought it would be worth summarizing the 6 priorities for future progress towards fulfilling WSIS goals that emerged from the consultation and are included in the conclusion to the report. And those were, so first, continued efforts to close digital divides, including the gender digital divide, through infrastructure investment, targeted efforts on affordability and digital literacy. Second, achieve and secure digital environment, particularly cybersecurity. Third, the development of regulatory frameworks for data governance and privacy and AI ethics, and the responsibilities and accountability of digital stakeholders in contexts such as information integrity, technological inequality and bias, environmental sustainability and human rights. Fourth, efforts to accelerate innovation in areas that will help achieve sustainable development, including digital public infrastructure and public goods. Fifth, greater policy coherence at national level. And sixth, stronger collaboration at international level, including greater inclusion of developing countries in decision-making processes. So I hope that's given a broad picture of what's in the report, which is now on its way to the General Assembly, and I hope you'll look at it in more depth online. There'll obviously be contributions from other UN entities, including ITU and UNESCO in particular, UNDP also, and consultations at the IGF and the WSIS Forum. This forum is more concerned with the Geneva outcome documents organised by ITU. So those are being held in June and July. Finally, a few words on the process. The President of the General Assembly appointed 2 co-facilitators last week. So these are national ambassadors to the UN who will guide the development of the text that will be put before the General Assembly in December. And they're the ambassadors from Albania and Kenya. They've only just been appointed, so there isn't yet a detailed timetable or structure for the consultation process. That will emerge fairly soon, but I can only say anything about it at the moment in general terms. There is a strong stated commitment to multi-stakeholder engagement in that consultation process. There will be several stages of consultation as it moves forward towards the Assembly session in December. And the normal process for consideration by the General Assembly is the development quite early of a broad document setting out themes for discussion, followed by a zero draft, which is a kind of initial attempt at a text of the kind that might be adopted by the Assembly. That's then amended, altered, and adapted with additions and deductions through consultations and negotiations. So that's the process on which I'm contracted to work with the UN over the remainder of the year. Consultations will be multi-stakeholder, but as this is a General Assembly process, negotiations are the responsibility of member states, that is, of governments. So as I say, I can't give any more detail at the moment because details are being finalised by the co-facilitators and the Secretariat, which is the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I thought I'd end with one point of reflection about consultation inputs, which I'm sure many of you will be making based on 20 years of experience with UN entities and the consultation processes that they've been using over that time. This is very much speaking as myself. What's most significant, it seems to me, and I think this was demonstrated at the summit 20 years ago, what's most significant is the value of the interaction of ideas between governments and other stakeholders. So this informal exchange of ideas can be more important than formal statements and position papers in determining the final outcome. And the most influential consultation contributions, to my mind, are usually those that explore and respond to differences of viewpoints, to what others are saying, that include analysis and fresh thinking rather than merely restating established positions, and that reflect on ways of developing a text, an agreement that looks towards the future and can achieve the widest possible agreement. So it isn't always easy, and no one's going to get everything they want out of negotiations, but I do think the WSIS outcomes have showed 20 years ago that it's feasible to achieve agreement that has lasting substance, even when that seems during the process to be very difficult. It requires effort, but that effort can be substantially worthwhile. So I think that's my summary for the moment, Alicia, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that are raised insofar as I can do so.
Thank you very much, David. I think that was a great overview, and you've taken us through 20 years and also the recent report in really great time. So just a reminder of how to kind of ask a question. So you can click on the Q&A box. So if you click more and then Q&A, or you should have it in your taskbar, you can enter a question. Or if there aren't any questions for David, then we will go to the next speaker, but you can always ask him a question later. I can see that we haven't got any open questions at the moment, but maybe just give it a minute. Olivier.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alicia. Olivier Crépin-Leblanc speaking. And thank you very much for this good introduction, David. I have a question because I forwarded, of course, this invitation to a number of people in the UK chapter of the Internet Society. And some are asking and saying, well, is it, how can one still get involved? Is it a bit too late? If one wants to support this, is there anything that the community can do to support it? Because of course we're all concerned about the renewal of the WSIS and the future and so on. Or is it too late now?
No, it's certainly not too late, and there'll be a number of stages of formal consultation within the process that's about to come, with the opportunity to comment on the documents that will be in that preparation phase up to the General Assembly itself. I mean, I think I'd probably go back to what I said right at the end. I think this isn't just a matter of making formal consultation inputs, whether that's in writing or whether that's the consultation meetings. It's also about engaging in a process of dialogue amongst stakeholders, so between governments and civil society organizations, the technical community, the business community, and others. That these kind of documents evolve over a period of time, and they evolve because what is happening is an attempt to find the places at which agreement and consensus can be reached. So certainly you should absolutely be engaging, and everybody should be engaging in that process as time goes by and discussing with others.
Thank you both. If anyone else has a question, if it's easier to raise hand, you can click on React, and then that should give you the option to raise a hand. So if are there any other questions? Just have a look through. I think that might be all the questions we have. Oh, wait, I think Parry has a question actually. Parry, if you'd like to unmute.
Thank you very much. Parry Svendiori speaking for the record. And David, I arrived a bit late, so if you have already referred to this, I apologize if I'm asking something you have already mentioned. But there was discussion about merging action lines with the SDGs. Is there any reference to that, or is there any improvement on that front? Thank you.
So there have been suggestions in the consultation process so far. Some have suggested evolution of the action line framework, perhaps including more action lines, perhaps revising the mandates of action lines. There are others who don't think that would be appropriate. That's not something that's yet been discussed within this process. The co-facilitators have just been appointed, and we're at before the starting point. So there'd need to be a lot of discussion around what might happen to the action lines and so forth. In terms of the SDGs, the WSIS+10 outcome resolution from the General Assembly said that the WSIS+20 review should be an input to the review of the Sustainable Development Goals, which the General Assembly will do in 2030. So there's clearly discussion around that about that will be held. ITU produced a matrix of WSIS outcomes and the SDGs in the period after 2015. So shortly after the SDGs have been adopted, and I mean the relationships are not direct, but there are some there. That's since been evolved further into a document which puts together the WSIS outcome documents, the SDGs, and the GDC outcomes. So in this process that we're about to go through, there will be discussion, and there will ultimately be an outcome about how those three documents and sets of objectives relate to one another going forward. But it's much too early to predict that. So views welcome, I think, would probably be what the co-facilitators would say.
Thanks, David. We've actually had 2 more questions in the Q&A. One is from Abdullah Al-Sami, who's from the BBC, and his question is about the overlap between the WSIS review and the GDC. How is the WSIS review, or how would the WSIS review potentially affect the GDC processes?
Okay, so there are, at the moment, sorry, that's my doorbell, but it'll be answered by somebody else if you can share that. The GDC outcomes are currently going through process of the development of an implementation plan for them. So that is happening simultaneously with this WSIS review. What I think is clear and generally accepted is the need for consistency and coherence between the WSIS agenda and the GDC as those evolve, and in particular, there shouldn't be institutional confusion. So there's a general perception that the institutional frameworks need to work together, whatever they might be. But the GDC institutional framework is still in a process of evolution and will be during the course of this year. By December, it'll be much clearer, and I think that the negotiations will have to resolve that integration between them.
Thank you, David. And then one final question from Nick Wood. And this is, could a good outcome for UK stakeholders be raising an issue even if agreement is unlikely to be reached? For example, if the second principle is about cybersecurity, should the issue of the weaponization of internet, including on occasion by state-sponsored actors, be raised? And I realize that's a long question, so I'm also going to pop it in the chat. So any thoughts on that, David?
I'm not going to comment on whether something is a good thing to do or not. Because that's not my remit. My kind of remit is to observe what people want to say, not to kind of influence it or whatever. So I think basically, if you wish to raise it, you should raise it, what then arises from that is entirely to do with how the process works and how different stakeholders interact with one another, and what happens within the intergovernmental negotiations.
Thanks, David. And realize that you mentioned up front that there are some sensitivities around your role. So, but yeah, I think we'll talk a bit at the end about how to kind of stay in touch on the process, and I guess opportunities for input. So yeah, I think it's definitely good to be able to raise things that you want to raise. And I think now we will move on to our next speaker. So thank you very much, David. And our next speaker is Paul Blaker, who is Head of ITU and Internet Governance at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So since 2012, Paul has been in this role, and he leads engagement with the ITU, IGF and ICANN. He's a career civil servant with previous roles that include working for the Arts Council England, Number 10, and the UK Department for Culture, Media and Sport. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Nominet and the UK IGF for organising this meeting. I think it's a really good opportunity for UK stakeholders to share information and share views on the WSIS review. From the government's point of view, we are a strong supporter of the WSIS process, and we're preparing for the WSIS+20 review with a positive and constructive approach. For us, the review is a chance to renew the commitment at global level to build cooperation and partnership between governments and all other stakeholders to ensure that everyone around the world can take full advantage of the opportunities of digital technology. The WSIS framework has achieved a lot over the last 20 years or so, raising awareness of the challenges faced by stakeholders in developing countries and promoting multi-stakeholder collaboration to address them, supporting a global framework to share knowledge and best practice, and driving capacity building around the world. And of course, it underpins the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance that has enabled the incredible growth and development of the internet over the last 20 years. But there is much more to do, of course, and we face new challenges. There is still an urgent need to connect the unconnected. Only 17% of people had access to the internet in 2005. That figure is now 67%, which is great progress, but it's not good enough, and promoting connectivity must remain one of the biggest critical priorities for the WSIS review. As David was just saying, though, we've also seen a huge array of new technologies and applications which have transformed the whole world. And it's so important that the WSIS addresses those new developments in order to ensure that it remains future focused and fit for purpose. And actually, I think the WSIS process and its action lines have proven to be agile and effective at engaging with new and emerging issues. One reason for that is that the WSIS action lines are technology neutral. So they address thematic issues such as capacity building, access to information, confidence and security, cultural diversity, and ethics. And the government's view is that we don't need new action lines. The existing action lines give us a comprehensive and durable framework, which we now need to use to address new challenges and new issues. There are a number of other priorities for the UK that we think need to feature strongly in the review, and I'll run through a few of them. First, the gender digital divide is a continuing challenge. 70% of men are using the internet compared with 65% of women. And in our view, we would like the WSIS process to pay far more attention to the barriers faced by women and girls. We'd also like to see a role for UN Women. UN Women was only established 5 years after the WSIS in 2010, and it isn't currently mentioned in WSIS documents. We'd like to see an emphasis on the protection of journalists. According to the International Federation of Journalists, 122 journalists and media workers were killed in 2024, and 516 were in prison. And the WSIS has an action line on media, but in our view, it has not received nearly enough attention in the process. We'd like to see more emphasis on human rights in the WSIS process and more account of the damage done by internet shutdowns. The UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights is playing an increasingly valuable role on human rights and digital issues, and we would like to see that more formally incorporated into the WSIS process. And the environmental impact of ICTs also remains a challenge. ICTs are making an increased contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions, and the existing action line C7 on e-environment does not fully address that. And finally, of course, a key priority for the UK will be to reaffirm support for the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. We need to work together to demonstrate that the multi-stakeholder approach can and does deliver for the whole of the global community. And we need to spell out why a successful internet depends on the multi-stakeholder approach. I think to some extent this issue is more settled than it was 20 or even 10 years ago, but I'm sure some countries Russia, for example, will continue to push for greater top-down UN control over the management of the internet, and we need to be prepared for that. The UK is also proposing a permanent mandate for the UN Internet Governance Forum. We think the IGF has become a critical platform, bringing together stakeholders from across the world. There is much more to do to strengthen the IGF, but we think giving it a permanent mandate will provide greater certainty and allow for longer-term planning. In all of these discussions, I think we'll be helped by the Global Digital Compact, which, as David said, was agreed at the UN last year. The GDC said that the internet must continue to be multi-stakeholder in nature, and it committed to support the IGF. And although it wasn't perfect, the GDC has a lot of good language across a range of subjects that we will be able to draw on. It's also a priority for us to try to integrate the GDC within the WSIS process. It doesn't make sense to have two completely separate UN processes covering the same issues. So we were pleased that the CSTD resolution earlier this month agreed on the importance of integrating the implementation of the GDC commitments into the WSIS architecture. And we hope that the WSIS review will be a useful tool to make that happen. Then my final comment is about the process of the review itself. WSIS is a multi-stakeholder process, and it's crucial that all stakeholders are able to participate meaningfully in the review. And we were really pleased to see the 5-point plan for an inclusive WSIS+20 review that has now been signed, I think, by well over 100 organisations. The UK has raised this plan with the UN in New York, and we've encouraged other governments to do the same. What we've heard so far is promising, but we will need to follow the process very closely. I hope that all UK stakeholders will be actively involved in the review. There will be opportunities to comment on draft documents when they're published, and there should be meetings which are open to stakeholders. I think Nominate will talk later about how you can keep up to date with the opportunities to contribute. And I hope that all UK stakeholders will keep in touch with the review as it progresses and contribute. That's all I was going to say. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I hope that we can continue to work together across stakeholder groups in the UK to make sure that we achieve a successful outcome to the WSIS review. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That's a great overview of the kind of UK position, UK government position. And I know that Ellie from Global Partners is going to speak about the 5-point plan when she speaks to us in a few moments. So I think next we will go to another government colleague, Alessandra Lustrati, who's the head of Digital Development Cluster at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Alessandra, as part of her role, leads the team that is responsible for the Digital Development Strategy 2024 to 2030 and oversees the Global Digital Access Programme. Her work is focused on supporting the inclusive, responsible, and sustainable digital transformation of developing and emerging countries. Alessandra is a development economist by background, holds an MSc from the London School of Economics, and is an accredited senior private sector development advisor. Before joining the UK government, Alessandra worked with the United Nations, the European Commission, and in the not-for-profit and private sectors, with a keen interest in inclusive and sustainable economic growth, as well as the role of digital technologies for the reduction of poverty and inequality. She has lived and worked extensively across Asia, Africa, and Europe, and speaks 7 languages. So delighted to have Alessandra with us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for the lovely introduction, and thank you to Nominate for organizing this meeting. It's absolutely great to be part of the UK IGF, and of course to try and contribute to this really important discussion on such a kind of a key process that the WSIS+20 is. And thank you to the Nominate colleague for putting out my slides. Thanks. So we can, well, you've just heard from Paul about, our UK position in terms of how we see the WSIS process and the WSIS+20 review in particular. And so we hope with my colleagues that by giving you an overview of the way that the UK government supports partner countries in their own process of digital development, you will see how this resonates basically with a lot of the themes and action lines that also David explained extremely well at the beginning. So maybe we can go to the next slide and we dive in. Thank you so much. So definition, first of all, it's quite a mouthful, but very important to us. It's to support, what's digital development for us is to support the inclusive, responsible and sustainable digital transformation of partner countries. And I'll unpack this for you in a second. Next slide, please. But before I go into that, it's always really important to understand the rationale, the why we do all of this. So next slide, please. So I like to think about our rationale on sort of 4 levels. They're all equally important and interdependent with each other. So first of all, starting from the top, obviously, we all know that we live in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. And we also know that AI has accelerated this process. By now, it's quite clear pretty much to every stakeholder in this space that digital transformation is a really key enabler of social and economic development. And digital technologies actually, as the UN has stated in a couple of years ago, directly benefit 70% of the SDG targets. So really important to take into account the role of digital technologies in development. But then there are also both divides and risks that we've heard about from the previous colleagues as well. As for the divides, we know 2.6 billion people in the world are still offline. There's also a significant gender digital gap. And there are risks. There are, of course, a lot of benefits of digital technologies, as I said, key drivers of development, but the risks are around both safety and security, data protection, mis and disinformation, and all of that again, also unfortunately has been accelerated and amplified also by the very rapid evolution of AI. So we need to take all of this into account, and that really gives us the drive in a way to work on digital development. Next slide, please. So based on our experience, both in policy and programming work of the past, I would say 7 to 8 years, and the previous strategy that we had in government in this field, we've developed quite a complex policy framework that allows us to sort of look both at the benefits and risks of digitalization. Next slide, please. And we've represented this policy framework in this kind of lovely, colorful flower. Hope you'll find it useful. So when we think about digital transformation, we think about it from the perspective of course, digital transformation of the economy, but also very much of government and society. So it's a very comprehensive approach to that. But we don't want to promote digital transformation just for the sake of it. We want it to be, as I say earlier, inclusive, responsible, sustainable. What does that actually look like? When we work specifically on digital inclusion, we focus on key foundational issues such as last mile connectivity, digital literacy and skills, access to locally relevant digital content and services, with a very strong emphasis on basically those communities that are underserved or excluded, and in particular those marginalized groups such as women and girls, or people living with disabilities. We want obviously to be responsible. So in the bucket, let's say, of digital responsibility, we work on building the capabilities for cybersecurity, for online safety and data protection. And last but not least, and this is something that we've developed further in the past couple of years, like many other stakeholders, we've started getting quite concerned about, on one side, how can we better leverage digital technologies to have better tools to deal with climate change, adaptation and resilience. But on the other hand, we also have to be very cognizant of the environmental costs. Think about physical infrastructure, energy use of critical minerals, etc., that the actual process of digital transformation entails in the world. And therefore, really strong emphasis also on digital sustainability. Next slide, please. All of this has been encapsulated in our digital development strategy 2024-2030, which we published last year. For those of you who may have not read it yet, you can scan the QR code. The QR code will come up also the last slide. Next slide, please. And within that strategy, you would not be surprised to see that we've basically expressed our approach and also set deliverables and targets within the 4 pillars of digital transformation: inclusion, responsibility, and sustainability. And these are just the strap lines of each one of those pillars. I'm not going to read them through, but we'll share the slides with you. Next slide, please. And importantly, given that it is such a wide field of work and everything is so interdependent that you need to really work on everything almost at the same time. But we had to almost like sort of distill 4 areas that we felt were really very sort of, essential at this moment in the process of digital transformation of our partner countries. So we've defined top priorities in last mile connectivity, in digital public infrastructures. For those who are not familiar with the concept, DPI is about more the kind of virtual tools and platforms that enable delivery of digital services at scale in both public and private sector. So it's the kind of non-physical part of it in a way. Artificial intelligence, of course, its use for development and its risks as well, and the situation of women and girls. Next slide, please. Already by having said all of that, I guess in the back of our mind, we can already see a lot of resonance with the really important themes of the WSIS+20 review. We won't do the reflection together now because we have Q&A at the end. So I will move on to the next slide, please. I've also been asked to provide actually a practical example of how does this look like when we design and deliver programs in and with partner countries in the developing world, with a range of partners which are both local and international. And we have chosen to describe to you briefly the Digital Access Program that is actually our flagship program on digital development, and not the only one, but let's say one of the, let's call it historical ones that we've implemented already for over 5 years. Next slide, please. It's a rather complex program, but to sort of summarize it visually, we articulated it in 3 pillars. One really focused on digital inclusion, one on what we call trust and resilience, and another one on specifically tech entrepreneurship. And all of these are linked to kind of, cross-pillar work on knowledge management and sort of sharing evidence and learnings also with the other countries beyond the focal countries of the program, which are, as you see at the top, Brazil, Indonesia, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. So we are currently amplifying also in the relevant, in the respective regions through sharing knowledge from this program. Next slide, please. To explain a little bit better how the approach looks like is what I call the DAP stack. First of all, we focus on the fundamental, on the kind of foundational block of last mile connectivity. We layer on top of it, of course, work on digital skills, digital literacy and skills. And these together, especially in groups and communities that are normally underserved and or excluded, provides and enables a better access to digital content and services. But of course, we want this to be safe and secure. Sorry. So we also always in parallel work on cyber hygiene awareness of the users, but also cybersecurity capacity of government and business. And we also make sure that we promote online safety practices and that we ensure data protection. And all of that together, has actually enabled the kind of thriving of local digital entrepreneurship and innovation. And ultimately, which is possibly even more important, the participation of citizens in society and government through digital means. So digital participation and democracy. Next slide, please. To go even deeper into the details so that you can really see how this looks in practice, the next colleague who will speak after me from British Standards Institution, BSI, will go through a particular project level example that is part of the wider digital access program. Just consider through that up, we have about 100 projects at the moment live across 5 countries. So it's a very broad programs, but we really value this specific partnership with BSI on digital standards because they have such an important role in driving inclusive digital transformation. So I will, before I pass the mic back to the facilitator, just next slide, to say thank you to all of you. And if you do want to keep in touch, these are our contacts and you can still scan the QR code for the strategy. Thank you very much. Back to Alicia.
Thank you, Alessandra. That was incredibly informative. And I think there's just so much going on and definitely you can see a lot of links to the WSIS action lines based on what you've just presented. So the next speaker follows on really nicely from Alessandra's intervention, and that is Jennifer Bissett, who is Principal Consultant of International Projects at the British Standards Institution. So Jennifer has over 20 years of experience as an international development professional. She is Principal Consultant at BSI, which is the UK's national standards body. As part of the international projects team, Jennifer works with partners to deliver impactful economic, developmental and sustainability outcomes primarily by strengthening institutional capacity, quality infrastructure and trade facilitation, and also through promoting private sector development in developing countries and emerging economies. Amongst many large and complex projects for which she's a project director, Jennifer manages BSI's ongoing partnership with the UK FCDO's Digital Access Programme, as Alessandra's just mentioned, and that looks at supporting and developing, looks at supporting emerging economies to advance their digital transformation through the use of international standards. So without further ado, over to Jennifer, and I think we have your slides up.
Thank you, Alicia. Good morning. Good morning. As Alessandra mentioned, I was invited to provide a practical example of digital development through the use of standards, specifically on a project which is part of the Digital Access Programme. Just for you to know, BSI is a non-profit distributing private company incorporated by Royal Charter, and we have an MOU with DBT, which gives BSI the responsibility and the authority to be the UK's national standards body. So BSI is also a delivery partner for FCDO development programs. And today I'll provide you with some background to the project, touch upon how the delivery aligns with the WSIS challenges and priorities, as well as share some highlights. Next slide, please. So 4 years ago, BSI published a white paper on the role standards can play in supporting the transition to a digital economy and facilitating digital trade. The white paper highlighted how standards are a crucial enabler for trade, including digital trade and e-commerce. It's quite well documented now that standards facilitate trade by improving quality, compatibility, supporting innovation, creating economies of scale, and reducing transaction costs. But the white paper also identified a policy gap. While legislation and regulation are usually the main tools referred to in policy assessments and action plans for developing countries, standards are usually the missing keystone in the bridge to a digital economy. So to tackle this, BSI started working in partnership with UNCTAD to embed standards in their e-trade readiness assessments. And BSI also joined the UN-led e-trade for all network. One of the recommendations of the white paper was to develop a standards-based toolkit focused on leveraging standards to address core digital themes and build a resilient digital economy. We developed the toolkit in consultation with experts from various international organizations who together identified the challenges and the opportunities standards could support. These are mainly organized around 4 building blocks covering the role of standards in promoting information security and cybersecurity, protection of privacy, interoperability in cloud, and secure digital ID. So to find out more about the toolkit, I've also included a QR code. This one leads you to a 2-minute video. So once we had developed the toolkit, we partnered with the UK government, and as part of the Digital Access Programme, we successfully piloted the application of the toolkit in Indonesia and Kenya. And then we expanded to Brazil and Nigeria, and soon, next week, to South Africa. Next slide, please. In each country, the project team delivers a needs assessment, engages public and private stakeholders in policy roundtables, and provides capacity building on international standards. So from this theory of change, you can see that our project addresses policy challenges very similar to the ones identified in the WSIS report that David highlighted, in particular in the areas of cybersecurity and data governance, protection, and privacy. The program has evolved, so the project since has now additional activities specifically to support AI standards awareness, inclusive standards development, and we've also built a community knowledge sharing platform. And I think the way our project is evolving resonates with the priorities for future progress towards achieving some of the WSIS outcomes that we have heard from David, which emerged from the consultation. In particular, there were 2 that he mentioned. One was on improving trust and confidence, and the other one was on addressing challenges of data governance, privacy, AI ethics, and biases. And then the final slide, please. Just to mention that the project is ongoing. We are pleased with the achievements of our project to date, and we've received very positive feedback from participants. For me, it's been really interesting to see the different approaches to the delivery in each country. For example, in Kenya, BSI's engagement was embedded in a high-level UN event and weaved into Kenya's national e-commerce strategy development. Now, we're we've managed to raise awareness and build capacity of government officials, and this is an ongoing process, to use international standards as an additional tool to support their country in engaging digital transformation. And I was very pleased to hear the importance of capacity building mentioned by Paul and also referred to in the WSIS report. So to conclude, I would say that the toolkit from our side has helped demonstrate how national standards bodies, working closely with the public and private sector, as well as other institutions within what we call the national quality infrastructure, can help build trust and provide confidence in the digital transformation process and facilitate digital trade. And as mentioned in the UK's digital development strategy, as well as the WSIS report, standards can provide a lever to inclusive digital transformation around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a great canter through that project, and I think it's really nice to actually hear about a live program. So thank you for mixing it up. But we'll definitely have a chance to ask Jennifer and all our other panelists questions after we're done hearing from all our speakers. So we'll move on to our next speaker now, and that is Ellie McDonald, who is a policy and advocacy lead at Global Partners Digital. So Ellie leads on delivery of policy and advocacy activities that seek to ensure a more rights-respecting digital policy landscape. She has a particular focus on internet governance, trust and security and emerging technologies, and leads coordination of the organization's strategy on the WSIS+20 review process. Previously, she has worked for the Equal Rights Trust and Article 19. So over to you, Ellie.
Many thanks, Alicia, for that introduction, and to the UK IGF for hosting this webinar. And I feel very privileged to speak after such informed speakers. I'd like to focus my remarks on three things in particular. So first, what the WSIS has delivered and therefore why it's so valuable to promote and to preserve it at this juncture. Second, what the WSIS has not delivered or where there are shortcomings which should be addressed and require us to re-examine our approach. And then finally, based on this, what should be the priorities for the WSIS in its next phase from the perspective of GPD. So coming first to what the WSIS has delivered, and I can be quite brief on this because it's been covered by the speakers before me. I think it's important, though, to say that one of the reasons that our diverse communities care about the WSIS is because of our shared ownership and investment in its vision, goals, and institutions. GPD, for example, we've worked in processes, including the WSIS, that seek to shape the digital environment for over the past 2 decades. And we find very helpful that the WSIS both consolidated the principle of collaborative multi-stakeholder governance, but also connected it to the achievement of digital inclusion and digital development goals. In the period since the WSIS, we've seen many examples of how multi-stakeholder approaches have delivered the WSIS goals. For instance, we have been involved in the development and implementation of many national cybersecurity and digital strategies, many of which have been built with and by civil society and other stakeholders. We've also seen how civil society and other stakeholders have stepped in to provide community-centered connectivity models where market solutions have not been feasible or attractive. And we've also seen how the WSIS follow-up procedures and critically the IGF have supported these developments. So both the IGF and the national and regional initiatives have provided critical spaces for networking, trust building, and dialogue, as I think our event today demonstrates, which have enabled all of these other developments to take place. And that's why what can often seem like a fairly colourless part of the WSIS's achievements, its institutions, is actually so critical to achieving the rest of the WSIS outcomes. But having said this, it's also important to be clear-eyed about the areas where progress is lacking. And I think you've already heard about this from David in relation to the CSTD's very comprehensive report and other speakers. The fact, for example, that still 1/3 of the world remains unconnected, the rapid changes to market structures and business models that have led to increasing concentration of power by a small number of companies across all levels of the stack, and the manner in which this has hindered local digital ecosystems and the range of impacts on human rights. And finally, of course, the current geopolitical fractures and the risk of reduced funding for both multilateral and multi-stakeholder venues, and how this could further fracture digital policy making. In the context of all of this, the review cannot per se deal squarely with all of these issues, but it can certainly consider them and think about which strategies are most effective to respond to these challenges in this new era. And that's why it's so valuable to hear that the UK will be taking a proactive agenda to respond to these challenges. We think that's incredibly important. Based on this quick super high level summary, I'd like to share just a couple things that we at GPD think it's important to be prioritised in this upcoming review without claiming to be exhaustive. So the first is that we believe the next phase of the WSIS should have an enhanced focus on mainstreaming international human rights law and more formal recognition of the role of the UN human rights mechanisms. And it was great to hear that this is one of the UK's priorities. We think that international human rights law methodologies and tools such as due diligence and human rights impact assessment provide the necessary tools that we need to mitigate risks and eliminate harms, and are therefore a precondition for achieving the WSIS outcomes. We're concerned by narratives that undermine the SDGs or perspectives that seek to trade them off or view them as a zero-sum game. We see them as inherently connected. Second, to achieve the WSIS vision, and also the vision of the Pact for the Future and the Agenda 2030, which we've already heard this current review will be an input to. We think it's vital to ensure complementarity of processes and avoid overlap. The proliferation, of different processes has made it more difficult for lesser resourced stakeholders to engage. And that's why there is a utility in having a single space to bring stakeholders together. We see that the IGF has been and can continue to be this space, which is why we think it's so important that its mandate is renewed and strengthened, while ensuring sustainable financial resources and also considering how to make its processes more open, inclusive and transparent. Well, it's really positive to hear that this is a priority of the UK, and like Paul before me, at GPD we really welcome that the recent CSTD resolution recommended that the Global Digital Compact be implemented through the WSIS architecture. Third and finally, it's essential that the WSIS implementation and its follow-up procedures, so particularly this current review, preserve and promote multi-stakeholder approaches. The WSIS original summit provided a cornerstone of digital policy making and of the value of multi-stakeholderism in that policy making. And we think it's important that this upcoming review demonstrates in practice how multi-stakeholderism can be embedded in both multi-stakeholder and multilateral processes. So multilateral referring to the governmental proportion of the review. And with that final objective in mind, that the WSIS should embed these approaches in practice, we, GPD, alongside the number is now over 170 organisations and independent experts from across civil society, the technical community, industry and academia, we recently published this 5-point plan for an inclusive WSIS+20 review. That plan sets out practical recommendations from our communities to help guide the agencies responsible with operationalising the review modalities to ensure transparency, inclusivity and meaningful stakeholder engagement. So we encourage all stakeholders to review this plan and to see GPD and its other endorsers as a resource. We're also currently considering building on it with practical guidance for how the stakeholder consultations can be implemented in the most inclusive way. So I hope we might have an opportunity to talk about that in more depth in the Q&A, but I'll hand over back to you, Alicia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. That was a great account of kind of both a look back at what WSIS has achieved and a look forward to some of the areas which might need kind of renewed focus. So thank you very much for that. And I've popped a link to the call to action in the chat if anyone wants to have a look at that. Next, we will go to my colleague, Nick, who is Nominet's General Counsel and Head of Stakeholder Relations. So Nick oversees our work on internet governance and is currently chair of the CCNSO DNS Abuse Standing Committee and a former councillor at ICANN. Nick regularly participates in wider external fora, including the Council of European National Top-Level Domain Registries Centre's Legal and Regulatory Group, and also the Law Society's Intellectual Property and Digital Assets Committees. He also manages the Dispute Resolution Service and is recognized as an authoritative commentator on internet and domain name legal issues. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to everybody for joining, and thank you for all the speakers. It's already been a very interesting session, and I think speaking as a long-time sort of veteran of the UK IGF over many, many years and many national UN IGFs, it's an interesting experiment, I guess, in format to try to have a specific topic and a specific session going into one item in a bit of depth, and that's a food for thought for future sessions which we might organize. So thank you everyone for that. Yeah, so as Alicia said, I'm a long-time veteran of the UK IGF, and I think just as people were speaking about the WSIS, the review, the sort of trends, the broader geopolitical mix, and the high-level objectives, I was reflecting on just how many great sessions we've had at the UK IGF over the years, with a huge number of diverse topics, from the sort of going back to some of my earlier sessions on the sort of misinformation, the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandals. Although the UK is one of the G7 countries, and therefore, in relative terms, wealthy, it's certainly not the case that has led to inequality of society. So, yeah, there's still massive problems with inclusion, the digital divides in the United Kingdom, not least access, but also digital literacy and education and opportunity are all areas where the UK's Internet Governance Forum have had quite a lot of dedicated sessions trying to discuss that topic and try to look at the policy blocks around those sorts of things from a national perspective. We've also had dedicated sessions on the more positive sides of what the internet can bring in terms of the energy of youth and entrepreneurship, and looking forwards to sort of the opportunities of the internet. And not least, last year we had quite a long session on artificial intelligence and that thing. So the UK IGF has been a great sounding board for many of the topical discussions. We try to link it to the theme of the UN IGF of the year, and then feedback sort of messages from London. So that model has been, I think, very successful, and it's allowed us a lot of flexibility to discuss all the topical issues in the United Kingdom and then link it into the global mix in a way which I think has been really wonderful. But while it's easy to sort of be complacent and reflect on the successes, the fact is that while we relish in the opportunity for all the UK stakeholders to meet on an equal footing, and it's lovely to have the support of the government, it is sometimes difficult to identify sort of tangible outputs or decisions which have arisen from IGF processes. And perhaps at this juncture where we have the review, it's a good time to think about the strengthening of the IGF, making it more effective, targeting it. There are a lot of volunteers spend a lot of time on IGF processes, and it's a slow and I think perhaps I'll be interested in other people's views, but in my perception, it's quite inefficient in terms of the way that the mechanisms work and the topics and the workshops. It is quite cumbersome, and I wonder, when everything's moving so fast in terms of the digital society evolution, the information society evolution, the WSIS processes have not kept pace with the pace of technical evolution, looking at AI, for example. So, try to make it more effective, improve participation, as other speakers have said, the diversity. And I think perhaps at the root of it all is security of funding, so that it has a sort of ongoing security, which gives it a platform upon which sort of more sound planning can take place. And I think that is quite an important part of the future direction, if in terms of the aspiration. And a permanent mandate, as Paul said, I think is obviously going to be a very important output if we can get it. The second issue I just wanted to cover briefly, I know we're a little bit pressed for time, is that from Nominet's perspective as a technical community operator, we understand that what the UK government wants to do, and we support that, and we are very grateful for the opportunity to engage directly. We're very lucky with the officials and administrations over the years in terms of their open door policy to the broader stakeholder community in a real exemplary fashion of multi-stakeholderism. But I think we all appreciate that the UK is a single vote at the United Nations. And so one of the things that Nominet did, must be nearly 18 months ago, is with a group of other internet registries, starting off with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. We have a technical community coalition that numbers now over 30, covers all of the continents of the world. And the reasons for that really are the UN processes are rather opaque and complex. And so as a sort of private technical community, we share how to interact, we share information, we ensure that our respective governments hear a consistent and coherent set of messages around the importance of the technical standards and the basis upon which all of the internet function is the security of the technical standards which underpin everything which flows from the benefits of digitalization. It really is imperative that those remain stable and secure and interoperable throughout the world, and that's something that we try to emphasize to all the different governments, particularly in other cultures, rather than the sort of democratic Western led thought processes. We also obviously share information. There's a huge amount of work. A lot of our organizations are quite small, so it enables us to divide up inputs to consultations, crowdsource ideas, produce collateral. And in the run-up to the WSIS+20, we're holding increasing activity in terms of reviewing the opportunities for input, the action lines, and producing sort of help sheets for all of our community members, so that we can all carry out that and try to ensure a good outcome from the WSIS+20. We had a practice last year with the Global Digital Compact, and so we would I guess look forward to a similar sort of process. So I think I'll wrap up there. I just wanted to thank everybody again for their contributions and input, and it's really important to make sure that the UK representatives who are participating in the negotiations are given the full support and collateral and things that they need in order to emphasize how important it is that we get a secure and good outcome, and that needs everybody to pull together, everybody's input, and very grateful actually for all of the contributions today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Back to Alicia.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for that. And it's great to have a technical community perspective on the call to add to the mix as well. We'll now go to our final speaker, following which we'll have time for Q&A and any interventions from the floor. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Erica Morey, who is Director, United Nations and International Organizations at Microsoft in Geneva. In her work, she supports the UN and international organizations in tackling global challenges through technology innovation and engages in dialogue on technology, policy, and regulatory processes. A former diplomat, she was also co-founder and former policy director of the Swiss Center for International Policy Engagement, PoliSync, where she convened multi-stakeholder dialogues and led applied research projects for multiple entities, including the UN agencies, the World Bank, and humanitarian organizations. A widely published author and public speaker, Erica was senior researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute's Global Governance Center and Center of Humanitarian Studies, as well as visiting professor at Sciences Po Paris School of International Affairs. So over to you, Erica. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and also a very warm thanks to the organisers, to the UK government, to Nominet, and to all the other panellists. I feel absolutely honoured to be here today and have very much enjoyed everybody else's presentation so far. So I'd like to give you a bit of a perspective from the private sector and also from Microsoft on the discussion that we're having today. So Microsoft is a strong supporter of WSIS for several reasons. The first being that connectivity skills and access to technologies we believe are vital for ensuring that digital transformation can benefit people across the world, and also the economic growth and productivity gains that come with it. We therefore value WSIS as the key process through which digital technologies are leveraged by multilateral institutions and stakeholders to deliver sustainable development. Microsoft strongly supports the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance established by WSIS, and we'd be concerned, like some of the other speakers have also mentioned, at any efforts from governments to unpick or undermine this model. The starting point is the view that multi-stakeholder policy development would bring the benefits of the internet and ICTs to everyone more effectively than a top-down or state-driven approach. WSIS is the international agreement that established this norm. Also, the fact that a critical success of WSIS has been that it has established that the technical underpinnings of the internet protocol suite would be developed, enhanced, and operated through multi-stakeholder institutions and not through intergovernmental processes. The other important point of the multi-stakeholder model provided by WSIS was the mandate for the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF. We see the IGF as a truly global and bottom-up forum for multi-stakeholder discussion about the challenges and opportunities stemming from digital technologies. At the most basic level, there is value in how it brings people together from different backgrounds, perspectives, and parts of the world, allowing new connections and viewpoints to be formed. It then plays an important role in identifying and forming consensus views as inputs on how to manage the governance of internet technologies and the internet itself. And here we see great value as well in the role that can be played in bringing more marginalized and underprivileged groups to the table, and also giving a voice to those people at the table, not just a seat. Microsoft is looking forward to contributing to this year's meeting in Norway. We expect to have between 10 to 15 people there speaking in various sessions on a range of topics, particularly cybersecurity policy, online safety, AI, and data governance. And we're looking forward to seeing lots of you there, and do get in touch if you'd like to meet or chat about any of the topics we're discussing today. So turning to views on WSIS+20, what are we hoping to see from this year's negotiations? First, we'd like to see continued strong support of the stakeholder model of stakeholder internet governance. This, of course, includes renewing the mandate of the IGF, and it also means safeguarding the existing roles of the multi-stakeholder bodies responsible for the technical management of the internet, including ICANN and the IETF. We'd like WSIS+20 to reinforce a human rights focused approach, ensuring technology serves humanity and upholds human rights. The references to human rights in the Global Digital Compact were important, even if we would have liked for them to be stronger in places. We welcome that human rights language was weaved into the Zero Draft as a cross-cutting principle, and we equally want to ensure that human rights comes through strongly in the WSIS+20 outcome document. This is not just about underscoring just human rights law, but also principles. For example, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provides a really important framework for us in the private sector. Thirdly, and clearly digital technologies have evolved since the last review in 2015, not least with the advent of generative AI. There might be calls for new action lines, but we don't really think these are necessary. The existing action lines are sufficiently flexible, and it would be better, in our view, to make updates to the current framework in order to ensure continuity and technological neutrality. I'd also like to make a brief point on the GDC and GDC implementation, like some of the other speakers today. We see the GDC as an important part of the ongoing discussion about the global governance of digital technology and artificial intelligence. Its adoption marks the first time the international community agreed on an all-encompassing approach to digital technology, including AI governance. And Microsoft very much appreciated the opportunities given to stakeholders to engage in the process and has been the only company that has provided written and oral submissions at every opportunity of the process. We're broadly supportive of the GDC and plan to play an active role contributing to its implementation. For Objective 4 on data governance, Microsoft is a member of the CSTD working group that begins work tomorrow. For Objective 5, we've already been engaging in discussions around the new UN AI bodies, and we're looking forward to the forthcoming GDC implementation map to understand the processes for work on the other 3 objectives and how we can fit in. A couple of additional points is that on the 2 new AI bodies, the International Independent Scientific Panel on AI and the Global Dialogue on AI Governance, we believe these 2 new bodies should be part of an agile approach by the UN to AI governance. In other words, their size and structure should be small and nimble enough to enable it to move quickly enough to keep up with the rapid pace of innovation in the area of AI. The International Independent Scientific Panel should be composed of and led by multidisciplinary experts. We think that this should include representatives of the private sector, where much of the expertise on AI lies. Many of the breakthroughs and step changes seen in AI technologies are coming from tech companies, and it's therefore important that the panel can benefit from the perspective of these scientists involved in this work. Rather than conduct its own research, the scientific panel, we believe, should aggregate, distill, and translate scientific research on and notable developments in AI. And the global dialogue should include meaningful input from non-governmental stakeholders. Finally, neither the scientific panel nor the global dialogue should, in our view, reinvent the wheel. They should include learnings and aggregate information from existing AI governance initiatives and progress at national and regional levels, as well as through other fora, such as the ongoing series of summits begun by the UK, South Korea, and France, the work of the Global Partnership on AI, and international convenings of AI safety institutes. So with that, I will end, but thank you very much once again to everyone who's here, and I look forward to the discussion. Back to you.
Thank you, Erica. That was a really great overview, and there's clearly lots of elements of WSIS that Microsoft has an interest in and also an active position in, and it's great to hear some of those. So I think we've now got 25 minutes for questions for our speakers, and I think we have some directions on this slide of how to do that. So you can use the Q&A function, and I think we've got 3 questions in there already. But also, if you prefer to kind of raise a hand, then you can use the react button and then raise hand, and we'll come to you. But maybe, and also what we'll do is, if there's a question that is clearly indicated to be asked to a certain speaker, we will do that. But otherwise, I will ask the speakers to raise their hands if they're happy to answer a question. So I think that's how we'll run the Q&A. So first of all, Sarah Stanisfield has asked if we could get a link for the 5-point plan for an inclusive WSIS+20 review. and an overview of its projected implementation. I've popped a link to the plan in the chat, but I wondered, Ellie, whether you'd be okay to talk about its projected implementation and any kind of next steps. So over to you first, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alicia, and thank you also for the question. So the plan was co-developed by different stakeholders and published following the adoption of the modalities resolution for the WSIS process. So what we've done since publishing it is we've shared it with all of the UN entities responsible for interpreting and implementing the modalities in practice. The resolution itself is very short and fairly brief on the detail. So I think a lot will be left to the way that these agencies judge that it should be interpreted, and that will of course be shaped by the current climate and by the recent example of the Global Digital Compact negotiations. We've shared it with them and we've had some really positive responses so far. It will be in their hands how far they choose to incorporate our recommendations, but both GPD and the other endorsers, we stand ready to provide advice and guidance. And we're also, I think, as I mentioned earlier, particularly considering if we could provide further complementary guidance as a cross-stakeholder community on how the consultations that will be part of the review can be undertaken in an open and inclusive way. So if that is of interest to you, if you're from the stakeholder community, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I can share my details. And indeed to the governments and to David, if you believe this would be a helpful input, please let us know. And if there's anything you'd particularly direct us to focus on in that, if we do pursue it.
Thank you, Ellie. And actually, while we've got you, there's one other question that is for Global Partners Digital and also for Nick, which is whether you see the modalities of WSIS+20 as more or less helpful than those of WSIS+10 from the perspective of stakeholders. So a bit of a comparison of modalities for WSIS+20 versus WSIS+10. Are you happy to come in on that too?
Yeah, and thank you again for this. That's a really interesting question. And as I mentioned in my introduction, GPD was involved for the past 20 years or so in the WSIS, and we were therefore a big part of the 10-year review process. I think it's important to share for those that might not have had that experience that this year, the 20-year review is already starting from a place of lesser stakeholder engagement. So during the 10-year review process, there was a multi-year preparatory process that preceded the adoption of the modalities resolution and the formal intergovernmental process. So as part of this preparatory process, there was time for non-governmental stakeholders to give considerable input through some of the agencies involved in the review, including the ITU, CSTD, UNESCO, and others, of course. So we think that's kind of an important thing to bear in mind, particularly for the agencies that will be operationalizing this modalities resolution. And particularly to think, therefore, about how they can provide safeguards and additional opportunities for that consultation to take place. In terms of why this has happened, I mean, I think there are a broad constellation of factors, of course. We see that civic space is under threat in a lot of multilateral forums. There's been a shrinking of multi-stakeholder venues. There's also been attempts in a number of the UN forums that we follow to provide for more restrictive modalities for non-governmental engagement. And of course, we had the negotiations of the Global Digital Compact that took considerable time and may have taken some attention from the preparatory process for the WSIS. So that's why we felt that this 5-point plan, this intervention by our stakeholder community was so important to kind of put the current review into that wider context and advocate for more inclusive engagement. Yeah, I'll leave it there and interested to hear from other stakeholders too.
Thanks, Ellie. I think, Nick, you were also named in that question, so I don't know if you had any.
No, thank you for the question. I think in brief, I mean, just to add to what Ellie's very helpfully put in, the proof of the pudding will be the eating of it. The 20-year review is a slightly different beast than the 10-year review. The 10-year review, I think, was a bit of a sort of almost a formality, but my perception is, and we will see, but the processes of the review were more multi-stakeholder in approach than we've currently seen. And the experience of last year's GDC, is not a good omen, I would say, in terms of inclusive participation and opportunities for the non-governmental actors to make representations. What I would say is that actually, from the technical community's perspective, we've made inquiries, and it seems that the co-facilitators are open to a meeting with us. So that would be quite an encouraging step, that you can actually directly speak with the co-facilitators, because I felt that we're kept very much at arm's length certainly in the GDC process. And I guess it all comes down to the efforts that the co-facilitators and other parties make in order to listen to the wider multi-stakeholder community. So I think the jury's out, but yeah, I'm an optimist by nature.
I can vouch for that, knowing Nick a little bit. So thank you, Nick. I think David also has a perspective to offer on this question. So over to you, David.
Okay, so I thought, just a few points. I mean, the WSIS+10 process was different, but was more kind of experimental in the sense that it was not really at the time that clear how this would be, how WSIS would be reviewed. And there was a very long negotiated text produced at a series of ITU meetings, for example, that looked at the mandates and action lines and so forth, which then had actually relatively little impact probably in the General Assembly resolution. In this particular case, so firstly, the co-facilitators have only just been appointed. Now, one of them was also a co-facilitator for the modalities part of the phase, but the Lithuanian ambassador who was involved in that has now been replaced by the Albanian ambassador for the second phase, for the substantive phase. I think it is, so in other words, there's an initial process of engagement and familiarization there, and discussions need to be had. DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, is very keen to emphasize that it is wanting to engage in positively with stakeholders, and sees that as a really important part of the process. And I know the 5-point plan has been shared with the co-facilitators, so it is part of what they are looking at. I think the other thing I probably want to say is, let's go back to what I said at the end of my remarks at the beginning. Looking at all sorts of UN processes over the years, it seems to me that very often two things feature: that non-governmental stakeholders spend a lot of time talking about the process rather than working out what is the most effective way for them to make use of the process that is there in order to address issues of substance. So I think it is, whatever the process is, it is important to talk about the substance of what you want within contributions. I think the other thing is that the more formal contributions are not necessarily the most important. Just to reiterate what I said before, many of the formal contributions that are received are reiterations of existing positions that are well known and are very similar to one another. And I think what tends to be impactful within these processes is something that makes other people think, and that also demonstrates that those submitting the contributions are listening to what others are saying and thinking about what others are saying, so that they're engaging in a process of dialogue as opposed to simply inserting a position paper. So again, that's speaking as myself, but anyway, I hope that's a bit helpful.
Thank you, David. Definitely helpful. And I think we'll just take one quick response as well from Paul, and then we've got 5 other questions, so we'll move on to one of those.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add very quickly, we understand there is a plan for the co-facilitators to attend the UN IGF in Oslo in June and the WSIS Forum in Geneva in July. And I think those 2 multi-stakeholder events will be really important milestones in preparation for the New York process for the WSIS review. And it'll be important that all of us use those 2 opportunities. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. So I think we'll move on to our next question now, and this is from Professor Rick Chandler, who says that WSIS and GDC and indeed the SDGs have had very positive aspirations. However, a huge majority of current infrastructure development and delivery, especially LEO's low Earth orbit satellites and fiber, is driven by commercial mega companies for commercial gain and not governments. While these companies might adhere to standards to simplify global interaction, there's no form of enforcement of these or the much wider aspirations that we are discussing. Should the UN be mandating greater enforcement of these fundamental principles? And if so, how? I'll pop that question in the chat, but I don't know from our panel if you'd like to raise a hand if you're kind of happy to have a go answering that question. I think it's actually probably a wider question about how you can actually enforce some of the principles of action lines when I guess they are tech neutral and I guess to some extent aspirational in terms of what they want to achieve. So I think maybe this is a kind of wider question of how you actually enforce a kind of vision and a set of principles. So I don't know if anyone would kind of be happy to kind of speak to that briefly. Alessandra, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll come in to try and help, but I'm not the best place to talk from the perspective of WSIS as a process and the sort of what role that could be there for the UN system. But maybe I'm trying just to help from the sort of practical aspect of how we work on these issues when it comes pragmatically to deliver digital development in partnership with developing and emerging countries. And you say the key word, Alicia, which is tech neutral. We always try to be tech agnostic in anything that we promote and support. And we really think that it's important for partner countries in the developing and emerging world to make their own choices and decisions as to what type of kind of technologies and models they want to adopt. I find the question really interesting, and maybe the reference to fiber and the LEO is, well, it's obvious why it's there. We should think that probably also other mainstream models themselves, like mobile, can be very concentrated in some countries. So we need to think about, I think, the international space and how we see the power of obviously multinationals and tech giants, absolutely, but also think about the country level. The telecoms and ICT sector as an economic sector, as many experts around this virtual table know, has a natural tendency to be concentrated and to have market dominant positions. So for instance, one of the things that one can do to support partner countries is to make sure that they have, first of all, their own strategies in place to make their own well-balanced and well-informed choices on technologies. And on the other hand, almost like outside of the technology space per se, also looking at whether they've got the right institutions in place and the right sort of regulatory and policy framework for fair competition in the market. And that ultimately should provide the best and most economical choice to users, which is what we want to prioritize in terms of inclusion. So this is a little bit the view of how we try to do this pragmatically together with our partner countries, but I maybe leave it to other colleagues to comment on the WSIS process and role of the UN themselves. Maybe just a very quick last note is that rather than maybe thinking of enforcing as such, as we think about the role of the private sector, they can become an issue of international private law rather than public law only. So maybe we need to think about how we nudge the private sector to adapt and their own business models. So not just do CSR, corporate social responsibility, but really to shape and adapt their own business models to make digital transformation as inclusive as possible, which ultimately is good business for them and is good for development as well. But that's just my own very personal view, by the way. So I'll leave it at that, and I hope it helps. Thank you.
That definitely helps. Thank you, Alessandra. It's great that you brought in kind of partner country views and also the kind of development perspective. I think Paul from DSIP will also have some comments to offer. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, a couple of words. I think obviously national governments remain responsible for their own regulatory frameworks when we're talking about enforcement. But I think one of the key successes of the WSIS has been about sharing best practice in these kinds of areas. There's a whole strand in WSIS on building an enabling environment for investment, which looks at topics like competition, open markets, proportionate regulation, promoting investment. And I think we've seen countries around the world adopting these kind of best practice, and we've seen the result of it, which is that countries that adopt that kind of practice have better results in terms of internet connectivity and affordability. And getting the balance right between defending public policy interests and making sure that you are attracting investment is not easy, and there are many challenges, in particular, developing countries face. But I think this strand of best practice around an enabling environment for investment in the WSIS will continue to be really important, and we need to make sure that as part of the connectivity agenda that still features. We don't only look at all the exciting new technologies and all the exciting new applications, but we still focus on getting those fundamental basics right. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. And I definitely, my reflection from going to the WSIS forum last year in Geneva is that there's a lot of focus on kind of showcasing best practice and that kind of enabling environment that you've spoken about. So hopefully that will continue in July also. We've had an anonymous question, which is, WSIS was meant to drive global progress on digital inclusion and governance. Do we think we are seeing meaningful outcomes or just end this process now in order to protect against potential state controls or centralization under the ITU, etc.? So I don't know if you'd like to answer that question, please raise your hand. And I'll also paste it into the meeting chat. So, oh, sorry, that's obviously pasted the wrong question there. So yeah, I think this is really around whether there are meaningful outcomes coming from WSIS, or if it's just kind of endless process. So I guess a more kind of existential question, which is what we like on a Wednesday morning. Does anyone want to answer this one? If not, we can maybe move to another question. I think, so we've had a question from Mark Carvel, who is heavily involved in Eurodig. And Mark asks, are there any views about how the national and regional IGFs could coordinate on ensuring meaningful, substantive, non-governmental stakeholder engagement in the WSIS+20 review process? So really a question about NRIs and non-government stakeholder engagement in the WSIS+20 review process. I wonder actually, Paul, whether you'd have a view on that, given you kind of look at IGF within UK Gov.
Yeah, thank you. I might turn the question back to Mark, actually, because I'm sure he's got some really great ideas. It'd be good to hear. I think it would be really valuable to hear stronger voices from NRIs at the IGF itself and also more broadly. I think one of the ways in which the IGF could be strengthened would be to make sure that NRIs have a much bigger profile there, so that there's that sense of local and regional ideas, perspectives, views coming together at the global level at the IGF. And the WSIS process would be a good example of how we could use that. But I might ask, maybe Mark would like to take the mic if I don't want to put him on the spot and share some of his thinking. That would be good to hear. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, for putting me on the spot. Indeed, it's a very open question for us at Eurodig. We have, as I've also put in the Q&A box, an explanation of how we're trying to cover this in the program for Eurodig in Strasbourg next month. We will have a main session on the WSIS+20 review with a particular focus on, well, when we know more about the process, when the co-facilitators have drawn this up, and indeed we have invited the Albanian co-facilitator to join us in Strasbourg. We hope she will be able to do that. We haven't got a response to that yet. But so we don't know what the mechanisms of the process are available for non-government stakeholders. So it's a bit of an open issue, and we want indeed to push forward the opportunity for coordination amongst the national and regional IGFs to ensure that those channels for engagement are available, and we as communities of stakeholders in the NRIs can really help ensure that those interventions, those contributions, those new fresh ideas are registered and taken fully account of by the member states in December, assisted by what the co-facilitators have provided in terms of opportunities to engage. So we will want to push hard, and we want to have good messages coming out of Strasbourg on this. But it's still pretty open, and that's why I was, hoping that maybe one or two people here today can give us a few ideas. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. I think Erica and Illy also have perspectives to offer on this, so I'll bring Erica in first, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think part of what I was going to say was just answered, so I'll keep it brief. But I think the work that's already been done is a really great example of effective multi-stakeholder engagement, and we were focusing in on it recently in some work that we're doing with a group of students at the Graduate Institute, thinking about effective stakeholder engagement in the GDC. And there are clearly so many different types of models that can be employed here, but I think that the sharing of best practice and what you do on a regional basis is an incredibly important one. The other thing that comes to mind here on a slightly different angle is the EU non-paper on establishing a WSIS+20 multi-stakeholder sounding board, which will aim to ensure inclusive stakeholder consultation processes throughout WSIS+20. The sounding board would be composed, as you'll probably know, of existing structures, including the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group and IGF Leadership Panel. But it seems to me these kinds of ideas are quite interesting and useful because they can helpfully structure the approach for producing written inputs to the negotiations, which will reflect stakeholder views. But again, I think it's incredibly important here to work with academia and the policy community to harness what is working well elsewhere and what has worked well. Thanks.
Thanks, Erica. And I'll just come to Ellie as well.
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks a lot for this great question. I think the NRIs have an incredibly valuable role to play, both in terms of process and substance. So just super briefly on both, with respect to the process, we spoke a lot earlier about the intergovernmental process and some of the kind of structural ways that stakeholders could be engaged in that. But responding also to David's recommendation to think about those more other and informal mechanisms, I think the NRIs could play a really valuable role in facilitating consultations, so that stakeholders could inform the positions of their national governments, so engaging more horizontally in the development of their national and regional positions, as well as vertically in the multilateral aspect of the process. I think that would be really useful. And they could usefully come at or around the time of the development of the elements paper or the zero draft. So we're really looking at quite a short time frame, but hopefully that will inspire us to action. In terms of the substance, just building on Erica's point, I think there's a lot of knowledge that the NRIs can usefully bring. So I think having some really crisp and clear examples of how the NRIs have served the goals of the WSIS and been instrumental in achieving them will be really helpful as we move forward. And second, maybe also building upon what we heard from Nick earlier, the NRIs are, of course, best placed to think about how the IGF structures could best be reformed to serve the policy outcomes of the WSIS, the GDC, and the SDGs. So I think being a lively space for debate will be incredibly useful.
Thank you, Ellie. And thanks to all the panelists for your answers on that one. I think that was a great discussion. I think we've probably just got time for one more question before we end. So I'm going to pick one that is quite quick fire, and hopefully we can hear from all our panelists. And I think if you could give us one prediction for the outcomes of WSIS+20, that would be great. So I might go to Nick first, just because he's my colleague and I can pick on him. So Nick.
Oh, tricky. Crystal ball time. I think
your best Mystic Meg, Nick.
Yeah, well, I think it'll definitely be go to the wire. I think it will be a frustrating process, but I do see a renewal for at least 5 years of the IGF mandate, and I think there will be a lot of heat and light, but probably not a lot of resolution on some of the more contentious issues, which will be probably kicked down the road a bit. And goodness only knows, particularly with the situation in the US, what the future of sort of the SDG and the action lines is going to be. I think we just have to throw the cards up and see which way they land. Sorry, it wasn't a great answer.
No, that's fine. Jennifer, it'd be great to hear from you because I don't think we've heard from you in the Q&A. Do you have any predictions for the outcomes of WSIS, or even something that you would kind of like to see come out of it?
Yes, thank you. I think I'd like to see continued multi-stakeholder approach, and this capacity building is really important in driving impactful outcomes also in developing countries, and obviously the role of standards we think can support in that journey. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think come to David next, if he's allowed to make a prediction about the outcome.
I'm going to make a prediction about the outcome. I think I'd say there's a long time between now and December. A lot of things can happen between now and December. I think there are probably two sets of issues that you might think about. There are the sets of issues that we've been mostly talking about today, which are to do with the digital context. But this is the discussions at the General Assembly will take place within a broader geopolitical context as well, and are going to be influenced by that broader geopolitical context. And so the issues that prove most contentious may not be digital issues, but could be to do with broader development policy, for example. So I think it's worth thinking that not just about what your views are around digital development issues, but about, say, things like environmental sustainability and how that it should be reflected in this sort of document. Maybe I should have said that earlier on.
No, but I'm glad you got to bring that in the end. And actually, we're at the top of our time. So sorry to the other panelists for not being able to bring you in on that last question. But Sam, if we could go to the last slide of the deck. Just a massive thank you to all of our panelists today, and also to all of you for participating. I think it's been a really interesting session, and there's clearly lots happening within the kind of UK stakeholder space on this very international kind of process. We'll provide a recording of the session via the UK IGF website, as we usually do. We'll try and make that available as soon as possible. I think Paul had previously mentioned, and also David, that the best way to keep up to date on the WSIS process is through the UN DESA website. And that's the address of that. I mean, if you also just Google UN DESA WSIS+20, that is what should come up. But also we've been thinking as the UK IGF Secretariat about how we keep the community informed. So we will send something out to the wider UK IGF mailing list with an option to opt in to updates on WSIS, and then we can let you know about kind of key milestones like the release of the elements paper or the zero draft. So there'll be an option to opt into that so you can stay informed on the process. And I think really a final point is just that we hope that everyone does contribute, because I think there's lots of knowledge, expertise, and best practice in the UK, including in terms of how we do our development work, that is really relevant to this process. And I think it would be a shame not to share it. So on that note, thank you so much for attending today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.